and asked me if I could come help because his entire apartment complex, everyone in there had gotten eviction notices at the same time. They had 30 days to move out. And we did this kind of blitz campaign and were able to get the city to pay for relocating everybody and paying their first month's rent. But at the end of that campaign, it was really clear to me that we had lost 150 units of low-income housing. And even though we were able to relocate everybody and it kept it from being an immediate disaster, I worked closely with a lot of those families. And I knew that the rent that they were paying now was $200 and $300 a month more than what they were paying before. And so in a number of months, I knew that most of those families would be homeless. So for me, it got really clear that I was like, I could fight like this for the rest of my life and my people would end up worse off at the end of my life than when I had started. And it made me say, what is it that we could actually do to change the broad conditions that are going on? And it pushed me to really say, what will it take to actually shape the rules of the game that we're fighting in, not just fight defensively. And the way I got politicized, I had a deep critique and resistance to electoral organizing. But as I started asking that question, and in North Carolina at that time, as the right wing was taking over across the state and across governing institutions, it was just crystal clear that we had to figure out how is it that we could actually have our people governing and shaping the rules, not just for this policy or that policy, but fundamentally the thing that we were facing was housing and rent in our society is based on how much money you have. It's about creating profit. And if people can't make money by housing you, you won't be housed. So that kind of rule of the game was something we knew we had to change. And we saw the right wing changing huge rules by taking control of our state. So me and my co-director Theo started building our relationship around this deep desire to win. And part of what we saw in our community was some fear of winning. That winning actually meant being in coalitions, being in a relationship with a broader range of people than we were comfortable with, people who didn't agree with us already. It meant stepping into institutions that were contradictory and challenging, like actually governing, actually being in elected positions. And so we thought that was a missing space that wasn't being taken up by progressive movements, by the left, and decided that we wanted to build an organization in our state from the ground up that filled that space. So I think I'll stop there and pass it to somebody else to hear kind of what brought them in and where y'all's vision came from.
Yeah, so this is Adrienne Evans. I think that this was something that had been brewing for a long time, but the place that I would pick it up is the advent of the 2016 election, right? We had so many people who had been working, our organization was formed because so many people were working in silos and never really building the kind of collective power that it was going to take to win on a broad, bold agenda that really was looking at how do we have structural change. And the election of 2016 was a stark wake-up call to a lot of the country. And it was clear to me in that moment that if we did not really use this as an opportunity to talk about multi-issue building and building the arc between our issues and engaging people in a different kind of way, we were never going to win. I often say that, I think the progressive movement in some ways has become so aligned with party that we've lost our power in really being a movement of people. And I can't tell you the number of times that I've started a conference and said, it's not enough to be right. If it were, we would be winning. And yet our tactics have been that I'm just going to talk at you and at you and at you until you finally come to my way of thinking. And this moment really pulled back the curtain on the fact that if we are not engaging in real relationship building and transformative organizing that meets people at the source of their pain and their hurt, we were never going to be able to build the kind of movement in this country that could actually see progressive structural policy reform that made improvements in all people's lives and not just some people's.
And Good afternoon, beautiful people. I'm Bridgette Flaherty, the co-founder and co-director of Down Home, North Carolina. Just for those of you who don't know, we're, again, as Deb was mentioning, a statewide organization building grassroots power for multiracial working class folks in rural and small town North Carolina, really focusing on leadership development, strategic campaigns, and civic engagement to build the kind of progressive power that we need to actually change and win real material things for people's lives. But so Down Home was started in June of 2017. My co-director and I, though, actually started talking about Down Home in 2015 when Dylan Roof actually created or initiated the terrorist act in South Carolina against the Black church. I had moved away from North Carolina and I was in New York, and my co-director was in the Bay, and we saw that happen. And I was actually in my mother's hometown at that time, well, where she's living now in Hendersonville, North Carolina. And I remember calling Todd, my co-director, because after the incident happened with Dylan Roof, and then there was this beautiful action by Bree to take the Confederate flag down from the state capitol. I was walking the main street of my mom's town in Hendersonville, and I remember seeing a newspaper headline that said white genocide is coming. And I remember feeling really disconnected and jarred from that being the main headline in the paper on this town that like I had never seen before. That kind of outward racism. And I remember being like, oh my gosh, like, there is, this larger meaning-making moment that is really starting to inoculate itself into this small town. And yet I knew my mother's neighbors were like not the type of folks who were necessarily going to really like go that direction, but like knowing that this one paper was going to be the only place that they could be reading and making meaning from this, it really started to make me question what I was doing in New York City, what type of organizing I was doing there, and where I needed to be. And, kind of through then, and Todd was reconsidering coming back to North Carolina as well. And then, come like Adrian, we're watching the 2016 elections happening. And again, this same sort of like looking over or not caring about rural communities, so you're seeing Trump come up, and my mother's community, again, she never got a door knock from the Democrats. She only got a door knock from Trump. So you're starting to make these connections of like, okay, some people who are controlling the media are making sense by saying white genocide is coming when a white supremacist shoots up a Black church. Then you're seeing people getting all upset about the racism of Trump, but only Trump's campaign is coming to my mother's neighborhood, leaving this whole section of people who are actually really grappling with economic pain that they're going through. My mother was afraid of losing her house. She has had to deal with addiction of pain pills because she lives in a pill mill. And yet again, it's like, but where were we? Like where were people who have a different analysis and actually care about working class folks in these smaller places? Like where were we, And so come the election and watching the results come in, it was just really clear that if we, like, the vision of Down Home is really like, we want to be in service to a larger multiracial populist transformational movement that actually is home to a lot of folks that are with us, right? But we got to get some folks in and meeting people where they're at, building this bigger tent that is race-centered politics, as well as really class-centered politics, knowing who the real knowing what the real evil is, really, capitalism, and racialized capitalism. Like we were like, we've got to go, we've got to try to build in places where progressives weren't thinking of or looking at or caring of, and trying to build that type of movement and power. So that's what we did.
Beautiful. Thank you for that answer and also for doing that. So I actually want to dig in on this, that you all are working in some of the hardest parts of the country, places that have, as you were saying, increasingly become areas where white nationalists and extremist groups have been escalating their activities and deepening their footholds. So can you share what you've seen as contributing to the growth of this movement, you've already started to talk about, and how your organizing works against it?
Yeah, so I think one thing that we need to be really clear about is that Donald Trump didn't start this, right? This has been an effort that has been underway for decades across this country. And, you know, I think one of the moments that I think is really pivotal is the 2008 stock market crash. And it's something that we should really bear in mind now as we look at what's happening in our economy today. But when that happened, progressive foundations and organizations largely across the country pulled out of rural places and made a strategic decision that they were going to concentrate their wealth and their power in urban centers where they had a member of Congress that they could move. And that space was quickly filled by the alt-right and extremist groups. I don't know how many people are familiar with ALEC, but the American Legislative Exchange Council. This is a long plan, right, of how we could come into these rural places, institute really draconian policies, normalize them over time, and at the end of the day, we would have a Supreme Court of their making that would determine judgments on those policies, things that have constantly been stripping and tearing down the civil rights that have been built up over generations. So that's part of it. The other part is 9/11 happened. And in that moment, there was a resurgence in the alt-right white nationalist movement. And it was something that we hadn't seen for a long time. And their power continued to grow. And then with the election of Donald Trump, you know, now they have somebody who has become the spokesperson for that movement. And so they feel incredibly emboldened, and we see it play out daily in front of us. The problem is that that narrative of what rural places are and what meaning they have in the country is now being controlled by the far right. And that's the work that we really need to do in these places, is to remind people that many people might have voted for Trump because decades of failed economic policy have left them struggling to pay the rent, not having health care, not knowing if they can afford their prescription drugs, people making absurdly low wages, where, you know, this is not the kind of quality of living that coincides with this idea of the American dream. And yet, we are not, like Bridgette said, going into those places and asking people, what hurts? What would really make a difference in your life? And how can we provide a different social and political analysis that allows us to have those deeper conversations to make meaning out of what landed them in the place that they are? But in our absence, that's where white nationalist movements and organizations have infiltrated and are doubling down. In the last 3 years, the number of hate groups in Idaho have doubled. And they're showing up in places just like the places where Bridgette and I are organizing. And it is that is the only narrative. It is the only thing that is filling that space. And if we continue to ignore rural communities and the deep hurt that people are feeling and experiencing and making sense out of those policies, we will be sacrificing whole parts of this country to the right-wing movement. And it is probably the most dangerous threat we face in our time.
Yeah, and I'll just say, going off of what Adrienne said, so, you know, when Down Home was formed, it was really just two people. It was Todd and myself. And so we were trying to say to ourselves, okay, North Carolina is, out of 100 counties, 80 counties are rural. There is, you know, I will say this, North Carolina has a very rich tradition of rural organizing. It is not like there haven't been rural communities in North Carolina coming together and improving things for themselves and changing the direction of the state, for sure. But in particular places that we were looking at, you know, there had been disinvestment for decades. And so, you know, we could have done a lot of where were we going to start, but we had 4 criteria, but I think the one that speaks to this question is one of the criteria that we had was we were looking at active white nationalist or neo-Confederate organizing and saying, okay, in addition to these layers of these counties are experiencing deep economic pain because of NAFTA and other, economic collapse, let's look at that. Let's look at also, proximity to cities and so we can be building this urban rural connection. But again, we were looking at white nationalist activity and saying, we want to go head to head. Because again, we really believe that this country right now, is at a very serious crossroads, as is the globe. I mean, oh my gosh, more so now than back in 2016. And again, we were going to put our heart and soul into being we will make sure that fascism is not going to come under our watch. So we looked at Alamance County. Alamance County has a neo-Confederate group called Act Back, which is Alamance County, Take Back Alamance County. And then we looked at Haywood, which is in the mountains where I was, and that had a lot of Identity Europa organizing. And so, and part of what I think is really, we all know this, but is interesting is that, again, they capture the narrative and they capture power in these counties, not just because they are flagging, which for those who are in the South means basically waving a Confederate flag out the back of your truck. They're not just doing that, and they're not just, showing up in sort of armed militia guard, although that is happening. But they're also doing things like hurricane relief drives. Mm-hmm. They're doing things like mobilizing the county commissioner meetings and talking about, preserving the Confederate monuments, things that are actually really kind of the same type of tactics that we would use to be getting more people in. So again, recruitment was really happening. And so for us, again, the biggest thing that we're trying to do when we're trying to build power against these groups is really tell a different story. Like Adrian was saying, the more we can say, race is real. Race has literally been what has built wealth in this country. Racialized capitalism has created a lot of pain for Black and brown people. And we're not saying that race is not real. We're centering it. And we're also saying that race has always been used to divide us. It has always been used to basically say there's, again, that two roads kind of diverge in a woods, right? You've got sort of this white allegiance that the president wants you to go towards. Don't look at what's actually causing the pain, just build solidarity on whiteness. Or we know that the sort of goal of the left is to say, actually, we've got more in common when we unite across race and across difference to go to the people that are actually controlling the purse strings. And so we are telling that story all the time. In every conversation, we're uplifting the ways that race is used to divide us. We are trying to do campaigns that are really showing that we have more to win by coming together because we have shared struggle. And by getting in shared struggle with white, Black, and brown communities on things like mass incarceration, which is a really big issue in rural communities, on things like healthcare, that we're also able to build these real relationships. So, just some ways we're trying.
Beautiful. Sandolo, do you want to jump in?
Yeah. So the Carolina Federation is in partnership with Down Home. So right now, we're learning so much about rural and small town organizing from the work that they're doing. Most of the work that we're doing is in urban areas and in the geography of North Carolina, more towards the east. So in many of the places that we're organizing in, the majority, or at least 40, 50% of the communities we're organizing are communities of color. And so our main struggle in those spaces isn't so much how do we counter the temptations of white nationalism for those communities, but actually how do we counter some of the despair and some of the disengagement that is the result of the exclusions and the narrowing of vision, and very similar to what Bridgette and Adrian were saying, actually the abandonment, exploitation of those communities over the last few decades. I mean, we could talk about last few centuries, but I'll keep it to a few decades, that has been happening, right? That like part of what we're seeing is a reaction to the elite consensus of the last set of decades that has decimated rural communities and has decimated key aspects of urban communities, while a few people in urban areas have been able to really accumulate wealth. And so when we go to engage people, whether it's around electoral work or an issue, the primary thing that we encounter, I mean, y'all know this as organizing, but I think it's deep in this moment, is a sense of we're not going to be able to beat them. And part of that, I think, is the deep cynicism with which communities of color are approached to engage in electoral and issue-based work, and the absence of the kind of work that Adrienne and Bridgette are doing that would give folks hope. So when we go and we have our organizing conversations with people, it's a constant thing as well. We're constantly talking about race as well, and we're wrestling with people about the necessity of work across race, African-American folks, with Latinx folks, with white folks, right, across those different boundaries, and giving people practical experiences of being in struggle together, and transformative training spaces where people are able to express, expose, and name their pain and experience that with each other has been critical, but not just stopping there, right? Like we're not just a group therapy or an internal kind of racial catharsis group. We are interested in that transformative experience, then leading to people confronting, like Bridgette said, the actual architects of this suffering. And there are people across our lines of difference, race, gender, class, etc. There are people who have privileges, but we make a distinction between people who have privileges and people who are architects of suffering. And there are people who are sitting in rooms with clear plans about how this works, and they are not the same as people who have privileges. So we try to do that organizing, and it's not easy, right? Like it's so much easier to go after the people who you can see, right? The people who are the architects don't live in our neighborhoods. They're not accessible to most of us. So some of what I think for us, when we think about like, how do we counter the pull of white nationalism? It's not so much how do we counter its attraction for communities of color that we're organizing in, but rather how do we counter the effects of white nationalism, which has been a deep internalization that white nationalism will always be the dominant force running this country. And in order to do that, we actually have to make wins around our issues, but I also think we have to name the actual underlying economic system. So Bridgette was talking about capitalism. We don't use that language directly most of the time with most of our folks because they're like, what are you talking about? But we try to get people there by talking about ownership and who actually owns what's going on and where does race play into the things about ownership. So I think if we're not talking about that and not just saying we're going to win this living wage, we're going to win this thing, but also connecting each specific win to a longer term view of the system that we're in, people can't imagine something fundamentally different.
Beautiful, beautiful. So as you all have been talking, we got like a version of the same question in like 6 different ways. So I actually want to pull it up, which is about those actual moments that you're having with people. And really some kind of a core of the question is there a story you can tell about what can happen when you meet people with the kind of respect and dignity that you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that I would ask of everybody who's viewing today is, when is the last time you changed your mind about something really important? Was it because somebody told you to? Or was it because you had some sort of experience that moved you to allow you to see the world in a different way? And I think that's a good guiding force in terms of the work that we're doing. You know, and it's many things. You know, in part, we went door to door and we said, you know, I'm just here to ask you, like, do you feel that we are more deeply divided than we ever have been? Which was always met with absolutely. And I don't know what to do in this moment. With, tell me what hurts. And the responses we got were overwhelmingly, nobody's asked me that in 30 years. Nobody's actually engaged in a conversation with me about these things. And when we started talking to them about actual policies and what brought me to your door or what brought another volunteer to the door, we started having deeper conversations. And the response was, I guess I'd never really thought about it that way, right? And that's the moment where we really get to identify, like, what are the needs and bring people into community together. And if we can't do that, then we are not going to have any chance of changing the political and social analysis that's being given. And I will tell you that it was surprising, right? Because I didn't expect in a place like Idaho, right, that is vastly conservative, that most people would be aligned on a robust, bold set of ideas, from healthcare for all, to fair taxation, to green energy. But they were, because they could identify their own self-interest, or they knew someone who would be positively affected by some of those policies. But when we just write people off, and this, Trump does this on a constant basis. It's like a dog whistle, right? What do we mean when we say rural? Red, rural, racist. I don't know how many times I've heard from pundits, Trump's immovable base. And it makes me cringe, because how do you know? How do you know if you're not taking the time to dig in and have deeper conversations? What I also know is that when we tie those things to policy, in some of the most conservative places in Idaho, we saw a dramatic realignment on a political view that resulted in voting in a very different way that we have never seen in our state. And so it is that we have to be in relationship with people. And we've got to break out of what, and we've got to be careful in our own movement, right? That we are also not continuing to project and promote this idea of this good, bad binary. If you're if you voted for Trump, then it's your fault. If you are this, then you're good. If you're this, then you're bad. No, it's much more complicated than that. And we've got to be able to hold multiple truths. And I think I would say the same about anti-Semitism in this moment, right? There is a deep concentration to really target Chinese Americans and blame them for this virus. But we saw this morning horrifically how anti-Semitism is escalating at a rate in this country like we have never seen before. And so it's got to be and all. We are all in this together. Our futures are bound, and we've got to start really talking about that and how it shows up in the world.
Yeah, and I'll just say that, this work is extremely hard, and I don't think I could still be in this without the actual members of Down Home giving me inspiration and hope every day that actually the path that we're pursuing is the right one to be on. And I'm thinking about a man named Jeremiah, who is a 7th generation Haywood resident. And again, Haywood is in the western part of the state. And he came into Down Home because he was actually looking for clean needles. One of the ways that Down Home got created was, like, again, through a listening survey of people saying what they wanted to see in their community. There's a very real substance use disorder crisis in the western part of the state. And so some of our members got together, they formed a needle exchange. And so he just got in touch with us because he wanted clean needles so he could stay safe while using. And but part of what we were trying to do was, for those who wanted to learn more about Down Home as they were getting some support for harm reduction, we would talk to folks. And there was a moment when Jeremiah came into the work that was when the border crisis happened, a family separation. And so we were talking about the injustices about what was happening at the border. And at first, Jeremiah was really processing his own feelings of immigration, right? He was processing with these beliefs that he had grew up as a child about Mexicans being people who steal jobs. And yet there was a moment when he was watching families get separated that triggered something in him, and he needed someone to listen to him in order to say, oh my gosh, I'm now making a bridge to that community that is not mine, but I understand. because a few years before that crisis happened for families at the border, he was pulled over because he was driving with no tags, because he was a poor white guy who had a shitty job and, you know, was just trying to make ends meet by going to work. He gets pulled over. He goes to jail. He can't afford to get himself out of jail. And in that time, his 4-year-old daughter had to go to the hospital to have a surgery. So perfect storm of real pain, right? And while he was in jail trying to get bailed out, his daughter, like, he couldn't get the jail to let him out to go by his daughter's bedside. And when his daughter was going through surgery, that pain of him saying, I am separated from my child and I cannot see her, for things that he knew were bullshit. Like, he, you know, it's not his fault that there was only low wage jobs in that community post sort of NAFTA and pulling out of everything, right? The manufacturing, there was like one manufacturing place that got replaced by a Walmart. You know what I mean? So making sense of that story with him, then all of a sudden made him feel like he became the most ardent immigrant rights supporter. He was like, oh my God, what I thought was bullshit. Like, I'm like so in on this. He drove from the mountains to DC to then talk in front of 30,000 people. This man never talked in front of like 5 people in his life, right? But like, he is ride or die now because he could process it and then make sense of it, and then became like somebody who really was fighting for multiracial working class power. And again, it's like, the more we can just be in community and listen to stories and help make sense of things, I really see the potential of transformation.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you so much. And just for folks to know, there's lots of questions coming in and I'm recording them, so we will try to get to them. And in this vein of just believing in and actually taking the steps towards transformation, Sindolo, you talk about creating a fundamental shift in the very rules that govern North Carolina, a new political and economic agenda rooted in a culture of dignity and belonging. How does building local organizing teams lay the groundwork for that vision?
Sure. So I was resonating a lot with what Adrian shared. I'm trying to connect all the pieces because Bridget's story just actually really moved me. Yeah, what Adrian was sharing about when she was talking with the folks in Idaho and going through this robust list of things that people are like, yeah, I would be down for that. My sense is not that in the communities that we organize, people are against our agenda. If we say words that flag to them people they've decided are their political opponents, then they will be opposed to it, right? But really, it's not the issues. And one of my feelings these days, I'm like, I think probably 80% of people in this country are some kind of socialist. But the question is, do we actually feel like we have the power to get the things we believe we need? And along a spectrum, people are like, I don't think there's going to be enough for everybody. So if it's not enough for everybody, I want these people to get it, right? Or I don't think there's going to be enough, so we have to work with these people who I don't agree. So the range of differences, to me, stands out mostly as people's different assessments of who has power and who they should be aligned with. And that part of how white nationalism works is like, hey, I'm an architect of power and I'm white. You person who has a lot less power, who is white, your best chance of getting something is to work with me, right? That's an alliance that they're trying to broker. Similarly, in the communities that we're organizing in, people are like, you know what, that whole social justice marching, we have so many members who are like, Martin Luther King marched, what happened? Nothing. We wrestle with them about that. Actually, very important things happened. But like, there's this sense of like, there is a history of organizing and we still lost. So my best chance is actually to play the game and go it alone as an individual. So a lot of the building organizing teams is connected to what Bridgette said. There are all of these moments of rupture in people's worldview. They're like, here's the best way I figured out how to live in this crazy world that is trying to tear us apart. And then something happens where I can't hold it all together. I can't pay the rent. The weight of all the things is actually too much. And the question is, who is there in that person's life to help them make sense of what to do and to help them decide who is the us that will hold you together and who is the them that's been coming at you. And for us, building local organizing teams that are consistently in relationship with people, not just for issue and electoral campaigns, but in a process of helping people make sense of what is happening to me and how could I live well. That's why we think local organizing teams are essential. They don't go away. And that infrastructure is something we mobilize for issues. It's something we mobilize for elections. But the actual fabric, one of my teachers, Denise Perry, at my old job, Black Organizing for Leadership and Dignity, she had this metaphor where she was like, organizing is like a tree or a crop, but the relationships of a community are the soil. And we keep trying to grow these massive movements on depleted soil. And we have to go back in and build up that rich infrastructure of everyday connected relationships. And so much of our local organizing is about that, and intentionally building relationships across the lines that our opponents want to make sure we don't have relationship across. So the reason that we have a county analysis where we don't say, for example, one of our chapters is in Winston-Salem, which is in Forsyth County. And we're very emphatic that our chapters are county-wide chapters, not city-based chapters, because part of how our political opponents win is by saying the enemy is in the city or the enemy is in rural areas, and you should just stay in here. But their power, the right wing, the Republican Party in this country, wins by fighting at very different scales. And so for us, we're like, we have to build relationships where people experience having someone show up for them. People experience making sense of the world. People experience joy and laughter and weird jokes with folks across these lines. So that's how we see local organizing, laying the groundwork for then being able to take action. We can take those relationships and move into an election and elect people, or we can move into an issue fight and win something. And people are like, wait, with these relationships, we can actually win? Well, if that's the case, what else is possible? And then we're able to expand the vision. You know, people will listen to me because I wave my hands around when I start talking. And they'll be like, oh, Sandola likes to talk about like big change. That's cute. But after we actually win a campaign, people are like, what are we going to do next? And they start thinking about bigger ideas. So that's why local organizing teams for us.
Beautiful, beautiful. So I want to actually pull some strings from a lot of what you all have been saying, and then also some questions that have been coming in on the chat, which is that many organizations take on racial justice, but they don't have a program to take on economic justice. And then others take on economic justice without an equal commitment to racial justice. So what are some of the lessons that y'all are learning about building multi-issue, multiracial working class movements? And specifically, what are some of the challenges that need to be overcome?
Well, I'll just start by saying that we can't have a conversation that's real in this country about either economic injustice or racism without talking about how they're connected and related. Capitalism was built on the backs of slaves, right? Everything that we are talking about in terms of economic injustice is about racial inequality that persists in many, many ways and in our institutions today. So it is impossible to tackle any one of those things economically or racially without having a broader context for how these actually play out. So that would be the first thing that I would say. I also think it is imperative that white people understand that we have a powerful role to play in this moment, but it is to come to this moment with humility and to acknowledge the history, to be real about it and to say that, yes, I have been the beneficiary of these things. I do not experience the world in the same way. And for us to actually move forward together, we're going to need all white people to start doing that. This isn't about calling others out, but it is about owning this. So I think many viewers will understand that if we don't acknowledge the real history, we're condemned to repeat it. And that is as true of racial and economic justice as it is of the Holocaust. And all of those things are at play right now, and it is deeply terrifying. But we do have a moment in this crisis. Crisis opens up and exposes the cracks, right? It shows us the places where we need to go and how we need to grow and change and remake and rebuild these systems together.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that to us, you know, the issues that we choose are to work on come from the communities that have decided to engage with down home, right? And for us, it is not trite when we say working on raising the minimum wage is not just an economic issue, it is a racial justice issue. And working on ending cash bail is not just a racial justice issue, it is also an economic justice issue. It's for poor folks across race to be able to survive and get out of this system that is like perpetually keeping them down. And like the more we can continue to show how those two systems are like interwoven and connected and are threaded through everything we are fighting for, the more we were able to show the solidarity and the mutuality in those struggles. And so I really think, you know, it's little things like even when we are doing something on, again, we're going back to the immigration and the family separation, or I'll say this, going back to some of the drug war issues that we've been fighting on. So we do these multiracial webinars with our members for our members, and we'll take a white person from the mountains, again, who got busted on a meth charge, with a Black person in the Piedmont who got busted on a crack charge. And they talk about the differences, because there are still differences in how people are treated on a similar issue, but also the similarities. So it's not about shying away from, yes, there is still a race hierarchy in this country that is going to make an arrest different, right? Or the ability to get your needs met different. But it is also to say, look, there is like a real shared struggle here. And so whether we're talking about the drug war and showing the connections between Black, white, and brown, or again, when we're talking about immigration, but we're also talking about immigration was also mass incarceration and how it tears communities apart, so that Black communities can get connected to brown communities, as well as white communities can get connected to brown communities. It's like, we've got to be the ones connecting the dots. And again, showing that there is no separation, and yet still acknowledging the difference that race plays in the lived experiences of people.
So I'm getting all excited, thinking about all these different pieces, and part of that is because both my like nerd brain about theory and frameworks and my like organizer strategy brain, like this is one of the key questions that I'm wrestling with in both of those areas. I don't feel like I have it all worked out in my head, but I'm excited to share with y'all kind of where I'm at. It's like, I think so much of our organizing comes out of a period of Democratic Party rule under the New Deal from the 1930s to the 1970s. And because we were functioning in that framework, basically we were junior partners or sub-partners of the Democratic Party coalition of the New Deal. And because of that, we just worked on issues. We were like, oh, our coalition runs stuff, so we're gonna like be the racial justice people. And we're gonna push the administration on racial justice. Or we're gonna be the economic justice people. We're gonna push the administration on that. But it was all within a framework of New Deal liberalism. And that was the broad frame that things were functioning inside of. Well, turns out after the 70s, all of that got thrown out the window, and that actually the new framework in the neoliberal era, in the like profit above all things era, chuck out the New Deal era, was really different. We're even past that now in the moment that we're in, where the common sense, the idea of what society should be, is so against racial and economic justice that to me, it doesn't make sense to frame what we're doing as just this element or that element. We need to be talking about what is the society we're trying to live in? What is our broad view of what we're fighting for? And then situate our specific fights inside of that. So to me, like, I was looking at the different comments where folks were thinking through and asking questions around race and in particular the role of white people. And part of it to me is it's like, the long history of racism and white supremacy in this country, racism is not a separate system by itself. Class is not a separate system by itself. That whole singular system is one thing, and we can call it different things. I think it's very useful to kind of understand it as settler colonialism, which I think is a meaningful thing for us to understand at so many different levels, because it recruits people into the project of settling, and it recruits white people into the settler project. It can also recruit other non-white people into that project. But the question is, are we being recruited into a project for a society that we want, or are we building our own project? And to me, racial justice is not a project for a society as a whole. It's a critique of the existing structure. And that, yes, I think we should fight for racial justice. Yes, I think we should fight for economic justice. But those are just responses to injustice. The question is, what is the society that we want? And to me, public and democratic ownership of our economy is what we're fighting for. And that is both racial and economic justice. To me, we are fighting for the end of settler and exclusive citizenship structures. That is what we're going for. Inclusive citizenship, inclusive democracy. That to me is racial and economic justice.
Beautiful, beautiful. So connected to what y'all were just saying, and kind of throughout this conversation, you've been talking about in multiple ways that the story that we tell in our organizing is deeply important. So what is specifically important about the story you're telling at this moment? And Adrienne, I'd love if you can start us. You've been saying some very dynamic things lately about the story of hero and villain, and I'm wondering if you can delve into that.
Yeah, so I think we have to remember, I mean, we see it every day, right? The value and the importance of words. But language gives us context, right? It provides us a context for how we see ourselves in the world and how we learn to see others. And so it is deeply, deeply important that we use those words carefully and that we understand what what our intention is, but also what their impact is when they show up. Yeah, we've talked about, the hero villain scenario, right? And that's where we're at. We see it right now playing out in, all of this anti-government, anti-democratic, I'm going to go out and demand that the government reopen, even though I'm going to put my fellow citizens at risk, right? Who's the hero and who's the villain in that story? The right is very, very good at crafting that narrative. We need to do a much better job. And so what I will say is that for all of us who are sharing this space together, the hero in this story is all people. Working class, poor, middle class, people who belong, who are every shade and color, ethnicity, religion. People are the hero. As organizers, we are your champions. We are the ones that need to go out and tell your stories and make sure that you get the advocacy and the representation that you deserve. The villain is every single House, Senate member, every person in Trump's cabinet and Trump himself who have ever voted or tried to diminish your human rights, to strip from you your dignity and your humanity. And we've got to be really clear as we move forward, right? It's not the Democrat or Republican frame here. It's people taking back their own democracy. It's people finding a sense of their own power. And what are we going to build together? You know, the good news, right, is that people did build this. But when we can break down those divides and come together in that shared sense of humanity and dignity and worth, and fight alongside each other so that we all do better when we all do better, that's when we really will have a government of, by, and for the people. But we are the heroes in this narrative.
Yeah, and I'll say that this isn't just specific to rural communities, but this is really real around what our members do for each other in rural communities. Rural communities look out for each other. So much of what keeps a community together is how people come around each other when their tire blows on the side of a highway, or they've got a couple of extra, whatever in their refrigerator, and so they're gonna like do a cookout on their lawn. It's really about community and this like deeper sense of love for your neighbor that actually really binds people together. And so the story we try to tell is really that, we're doing and have been doing some race class narrative testing in our communities, trying to, again, really diminish the power of the way that Trump's administration and really others in government are trying to say that someone else is doing something bad for you. Or against you, and therefore you should not care about them, or you should, support these policies that are hurting people, again, like immigration. And, I really think it's interesting that so one of the stories I think about, this was a person in Alamance County, and we were talking about immigration and healthcare. And at first we were like, oh, do you know an immigrant? And the first thing that came into this guy's head was like a Fox News caricature of an immigrant, right? Some really bad dude stuff that Trump would say. And then, so he kind of gave that stereotype at first. And then we're like, oh, well, have you ever had an actual situation where you were dealing with an immigrant where you live? And then all of a sudden he shifted and he was like, oh yeah, my neighbor is an immigrant. Like, it was crazy. It was like, how did this not come in the beginning of the conversation? But he was like, and there was one time that like my car literally broke down and she drove to me and helped me take my car to the shop. And now every Christmas I send her something to say thank you for that one gesture, right? And it's like, that is the story we need to be telling. Like, we actually live with people across race in our rural communities where we depend on each other. And like, we actually keep each other safe. And like, we actually keep each other happy and healthy. And that the people who are trying to tell you that those are not the people that you care about and you're in a relationship with, they're the actual problems, right? And so that story of connectedness of what real like generosity looks like in community, again, across race, and then more pointing at the top than being crabs in a barrel and like trying to attack each other down, is what the story is we're trying to tell.
Oh, Bridgette, I keep going after you and keep hearing your stories, and I'm like, yes, we're gonna win. And yeah, I'm processing all the things from Adrienne as well, of just being like, oh man, I kind of want to be in the audience for this panel as well. So the question, Dove, is what are the stories we're telling?
Yeah, like what in a proactive way, what's the story that we want to tell?
So I think for the Carolina Federation, we're at kind of like, maybe one way to talk about it is like, we're in the lab. We have not already developed the story that we're now like sharing out to the world. We're like, what the hell is gonna work? right? Like we keep trying to tell these different stories and pulling all kinds of things out to figure out what's going on. And for us, the biggest challenge around the stories that people are functioning around, I think I already named, are stories about hopelessness, like we won't have the power to do anything, and then stories about working across difference, that people are like, ultimately people are just gonna abandon us. In particular, working with communities of color and folks being like, ultimately white people gonna be white and we're gonna be on our own. So how do you counter those stories? And I think there are two ends of it, just being really practical about what we do. Again, still experiment. So one end is personal stories. And just talking about, like Bridgette said, moments where people across difference made a difference for us. So me as a queer person, it was actually multiracial community that lifted me up and celebrated me as a queer person that allowed me to come into like a positive affirmation of myself. That was a huge deal for me, learning to trust white people, learning to trust other people of color who weren't Black. That's a huge place where I had that experience, and sharing my stories about how that community across race and class and gender, right? Like that it was like this mix of like renegades and people who were following the rules, but under the cover were doing a different thing, like, right? It was that whole community that lifted me up. Sharing those stories of difference sparks for people, oh yeah, like Bridgette said, I have all kinds of people in my family. And for me, queerness is a big experience. And, you know, you go into communities where people are like, I don't know any queer people. You're like, wait a second, but who's that real butch person who's your cousin though? And they're like, oh, right, well, my auntie, blah, blah, blah. So those personal stories that allow people to spark that, and it means we have to be willing to be vulnerable first with our stories around that. And I saw somebody in the chat was talking about, is there ever a moment where you have to get out of the car? And in a moment where you just cannot abide something that somebody is saying. And I just wanted to say a little bit about that, because I think this work around race-class narrative, or this work of working across power and difference, and when you get to hear all of the violent ideas that people have absorbed, as well as their pain, I think it's really important for us to understand that there is a trajectory of development that I think is required for doing that work, and there are resources that we need to be able to do it. So I don't think it makes sense for somebody who is just coming awake to power and privilege to then go talk to someone who is more privileged than them and hear all of the violent, painful things that they're going through and processing. Doesn't make sense. That's a setup. But I don't think it makes sense either to be like, oh, well, it's never the job of oppressed people to educate people in positions of privilege. No, to me, if we are able through our process to get the resources that we need to heal, transform, and be supported, it's actually the job of all of us to fight for each of us. And to me, when Adrienne was talking about hero and villain, for me, there was this really big moment in my coming out process where someone I was really close to went in on some homophobic rant, and I was like, I'm gonna cut you out of my life. I don't need you like that in my life. And then I had this realization where I was like, here's this person who's been socialized just as deeply and as long as me. And it took me 18 years to overcome my socialization. 18 years. And if it took me 18 years, why do I think this other person is gonna go through it just because they met me 9 months ago? No, I refuse to abandon this person to these destructive, violent ideas that are tearing her up inside, even if in this moment they're bringing up this challenge for me. Now, that doesn't mean I want to be in her process all the time, and I got to go talk to my folks and talk shit about her in the back, you know, like that's going to happen too. But I have a deep love for this person who I don't want to abandon. And to me, we have to have a deep love of our people when we're listening to their stories, because they're going to include violence and poison, because that's what we've all absorbed. And none of us are without that. Maybe across a certain line, you're on the receiving end, but there is not a single person who isn't on the privileged end of something. And those are also stories that we need to be telling. I am in this privileged position. I have harmed others before, and here's how I'm trying to be different. So those are stories that I think are essential. That's all on the personal level. At the political level, I think it has been important for us to tell the story of history where we've actually fucking won. I don't know if I'm supposed to say that, but where we've actually won. Okay, great. And we talk about the abolition of slavery. And it means something to our people. We actually talk about what it meant for the civil rights movement to succeed. And so many of our people are like, oh, well, Martin Luther King, he didn't really win nothing, or he's a national holiday, but nothing really changed. No, a lot changed. This country was founded as a white nation, and the civil rights movement and the women's liberation movement and the queer liberation movement transformed this country so that more than a third of the people in this country who are involved in whiteness now say, I don't want a country based on whiteness. I want a country based on difference. That is huge. That is huge for a country that was founded on the idea that this is a white nation. For more than a third of white people to be like, fuck that, I don't want it. And for another third to be like, maybe I don't want it either. I'm not sure. If we went back and asked people who are thrown off their land as indigenous people or who were enslaved as African people, do you think it made a difference that up to 2/3 of white people are no longer solidly in the court of saying, I want a white nation? They'd be like, hell yeah. So we talk to our people about those victories culturally, but also the material victories of it makes a difference that chattel slavery doesn't exist anymore. Our people won that. Our people won the right to vote for women. Our people won all of these different things, and telling the stories of victory and not letting people downplay them and drawing out the everyday ways that makes a difference have been important stories.
Woo! Okay. Yes. So I actually want to build on this, and I know we've just got a few more minutes, but with Bend the Arc being a Jewish social justice organization, a piece that I really want to bring in is how do we tell the story against anti-Semitism as part of this? How do we integrate the fight against anti-Semitism into this progressive populist vision? And I know that, Adrienne, this has been an area of your work, so I would love to ask you to respond, and then if we have time, Bridgette and Sandola, I'll kick it to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I want to start just to preface, I've had an opportunity to do a lot of this work. I think we need to be really clear about the definition, right? When we talk about racism, we're talking about a system. But when we're talking about white nationalism, we are talking about a movement that is designed to benefit privileged white people in the overthrow and destruction of democracies, to create authoritarian regimes to the detriment of everyone other. And so let me share with you a story from about 2 years ago where I was standing in Auschwitz. And it was at the segment where you either went to the camp or you went to the gas chamber. And the guide that we had pulled us aside as social justice leaders, and he started telling us the story of Charlottesville. And he said, I know who you are, and I want you to know that this is happening. We see it around the world. And we need you to go home and fix this. And I get chills every time I even recall the story. But I share it with you because we must be so careful. The right is so well organized, and they're organized to diminish and destroy Jewish people, black people, brown people, poor people, immigrants. And as we face this crisis in our country, we have to remember that we are all in this together. Because if they're successful, they will divide us. This will be about one race, about one stature, about one status, about the Chinese, right? And where the virus came from. It will be about people who are Jewish. But if we collectively organize to tell the arc of that history and that story, and remind people that 8 million lives were lost, and millions more have been sacrificed because that philosophy and that movement continues to gain steam, but has never left us. We must tell a complete story. We must not allow the right to divide us, because they are capable of winning. What I know is that when we come together, and we won't all come together, but we are mostly united on our shared values and vision and what it means to live with dignity, honor, hope. When we do that, we have the ability to change this country, change the democracy, take it back and remake it, and prove that we here too can fix this and show the rest of the world that this is not who we are and we will not become this.
Amen. Thank you, Adrienne. I think that we are at time. So I actually just want to go through and do a quick last round for Bridgette, Adrienne, Sandolo, all three of you. If there's any closing words, or if there's anything that's giving you hope or that you're excited about right now. Would just love to hear any final word from you.
So also feels hard, Adrienne, that was beautiful what you said. I mean, I'll just say this again, I think the task that we're called to do right now in this moment is to build a very large, interconnected, multiracial, progressive movement to counter the authoritarianism that is rising in this country. And yet I do think our movement right now has some tendencies to only want to engage with people that can instantly be read as you're one of mine. Like, I can instantly see you. And so I just want to say this. So my therapist told me this in couples therapy. She said, when I want to get mad at my partner, she's like, do the opposite thing. So I want to say this as like a last word to y'all. Like, talk to folks. And when you feel yourself hearing something that like just kind of like doesn't rub you the right way, maybe if your instinct is to say, actually, I want to like fight you on that or challenge you, maybe do the opposite and ask a curious question, because I think that can open up more empathy and connection that you might imagine.
And if I'll just dovetail on Bridgette, who I'm so delighted to be on this panel with because you're so brilliant. Following up on that, 90% of the time when you ask someone, help me understand your way of thinking, and do that with this curiosity and genuinely. I mean, we have a lot to learn from people who don't agree with us too, right? But when that happens, 9 times out of 10, the rhetoric doesn't hold up. And it's amazing. And it's absolutely like best practice. And I just want to say, Dove, to you and Sandolo and Bridgette and Ben the Ark, thank you for allowing us the space to share our stories. But everybody who's joined in, it's going to take each and every one of you working with all of us and so many others across the country. But there is hope.
Thank you, Adrienne. Thank you, Bridgette. Sandolo, you want to bring us home?
I feel optimistic about the medium and the long term for our movements. And I think that we are entering into a hard, difficult period. And I don't want to be like, cheerleader, it's all good, just do these things, read this book, practice this thing, and everything will be cool. No, we are living in an era of the collapse of a whole way of doing things. And in that era of collapse, Adrienne's amazing kind of distinction around what white nationalism is, different from just racism, it is making a serious play. And regardless of what happens this fall, which is important, but regardless of what happens this fall, that is one battle. We are in a decades-long fight between fascism and white nationalism as an alternative and as an answer, and the worldview that we're talking about. And the reality is our worldview is not yet well articulated, and our roots are not yet deep enough for the kind of change that we need. I think we can get there, and the thing that's exciting to me is so many people are feeling stirred and feeling moved in this moment, are asking themselves the serious questions, not what makes me comfortable, but what leads to transformation and what leads to liberation. And that people are willing to walk through difficult things to get there is what's giving me so much hope. We're seeing more people doing that. Like the number of people who are doing phone calls, door knocking, talking to strangers over the last 5 years, who are going out into the streets for direct actions, is just going up and up and up. Yes, we're making mistakes in that. Yes, we can get a little extra and start, calling each other out and those kinds of things. But I think there are more people questioning some of our bad culture stuff. And there's many more people just saying, I'm hungry to learn new things. That makes me feel incredibly hopeful about what's going on. And I think everybody who is here for this panel is such a representation of that, and just tracking what's going on in the chat box, the questions that people are wrestling with and the resources that they have. I'm like, yes, we're on the right track. Let's keep going.
Amen, amen. Thank you, Sandolo, Adrian, Bridget, thank you so much. This has been so incredible. I'm so grateful to you all for the work you do, for sharing your wisdom here today. This has been phenomenal. Thank you for all of the hundreds of folks that were joining us. Thank you for being with us in the chat and having your spirit with us. Want to just make sure that folks know after this in the conference, there are affinity groups, followed by some different after parties of all different kinds of energies. So the conference keeps going through the evening. And just thank you for your time here. And also be sure to check out these speakers' bios to look at the organizations that they are organizing through, support those organizations, be part of this work together. And thank y'all. Have a good evening.